Hi, this is my channel, What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It. I'm Terry Lay. This YouTube is about social class. What is social class? And the approach that I'm giving is what I call a humanist approach. It's not really a humanist in terms of ethics, but in terms of the analysis being based on ideas about human nature. So first of all, I'd say social class is a form of exploitation. And to define exploitation, a humanist approach would look like something like this. And this is what I've already outlined in the talk on patriarchy and so on earlier talks. So as I said, it's based on ideas about human nature. So human nature is made up of 6 basic desires or drives: autonomy, creativity, sexuality, sociability, hunger or the need for food and water and so on. Comfort and health. That's the 6th one. And so if you want to have a look at that idea in more detail, go back to the talk on patriarchy. Okay, so exploitation. In the context of this humanist approach, exploitation works like this. In transactions between the ruling group and the subordinate group, so exploitation always consists of at least these 2 groups, if not maybe others. The ruling group regularly gets satisfactions of the basic desires of human nature, all right, out of these transactions, in other words, right? Whereas the subordinate group gets frustrations of their basic desires, or at least they don't get paid back in a similar amount of their basic desires. There's a systematic pattern of unequal transactions which tend in one direction rather than the other. And okay, so then if you take that as being a general theory of exploitation, then let's look at social class as a form of exploitation. It can be, and what I'm about to say can be seen as revealing some of the hidden assumptions of Marx's account of social class. I mean, in other words, I think his theory of class is based upon underlying assumptions which fit with what I'm about to say, or it also could be considered as a new theory of social class. So, okay, here we go. The ruling class extracts a surplus product, that's a Marxist term, from the work of the subordinate class. The work of the subordinate class is always a frustration of some of the basic desires of human nature. At the very least, autonomy in the sense that they have to do what they're told to do by the ruling group, but also in terms of creativity, their work they don't express themselves in their work. These are all points made by Marx in his early writings. And sociability in the sense that at work they have to worry about what the boss wants them to do rather than about making good social contacts with their other workers. In a sense, the members of the subordinate class are inevitably in competition with each other for the sort of goodies that the ruling class controls. And also in terms of the work process itself, they don't have the power to make decisions about the distribution or the nature of the work. In other words, sociability would be making things that other people want and giving to them and getting social reward appreciation from that. They're barred from those very human interactions. The surplus product is something that enables the ruling class to pursue their basic desires. At the very least, again, autonomy. Let's say it's just in a minimal account of basic class structure. It's food, obviously, means that they don't have to work to produce their food. The ruling class gets autonomy from that, but also they can also reward subordinates by gifts of food, or by maintain an army or a class of tradespeople or whatever by providing food for them. So that the subordinate class is providing this surplus product, which the ruling class can then use to do various things that they might want to do. And through that, other desires, like for prestige, status, social reward, etc., creativity, you name it, right? So, and then summarizing this as exploitation, the ruling class delivers no equivalent product to the subordinate class. The transaction is all in one direction. Okay, so let's look at now, that's a kind of description of how it is a form of exploitation. So let's look at social class as a particular kind of social mechanism. Okay, the units of social class society are workers, but also families. The ruling class has power over the basic necessities for survival. That's a part of what Marx calls the means of production. So the means of production include things like factories, and I've said before, banks, railways, whatever. But fundamentally, class, if nothing else, it's based upon the fact that the ruling class controls the means necessary for people to be fed. And they may do this directly by taking food or by owning the land on which people work, or they may do it indirectly by just sending in their soldiers to make sure that a tribute in the form of food is paid. But in either case, they kind of control these basic necessities. They use this power over these basic necessities as leverage to ensure the compliance of the subordinate class. In other words, if you don't do what they say, then you don't eat or you get killed or whatever. They use it to extract a surplus product, leverage to extract a surplus product. In other words, you know, you will do this and produce more than you need yourself, and more than you're getting yourself out of what the work that you do to give to the ruling class. And their ownership of other means of production. So, you know, so that they own the tin mines and the copper mines, which produce the bronze, which is used in weapons, or they own the, you know, all that sort of stuff. All right. So now agriculture and the storage of cereals are the fundamental technological requirements of class societies. No class society has ever existed which didn't depend on agriculture and the storage of cereal crops. The basic class structure is in three parts. The ruling class, okay, so the enforcing class, like that, we could talk about that as the army or the police force, or both, usually both, or the army functioning as a police force, or whatever you might look, however you might look at it, and the subordinate class, you know, the class who are producing the surplus product. Okay. The subordinate class produces the basic material goods and services which the ruling class uses to control the enforcing class. In other words, the ruling class uses the surplus product produced by the subordinate class to pay, you know, pay their armies, whether that's through money or in kind or whatever. As well as they use that surplus product for their own subsistence. In other words, for the ruling class to live and eat and so on. And also to feed and house the workers who produce the lavish lifestyle and the military hardware that they need to maintain their rule, and also to live well and so on. Class societies have myths. Okay, so it's very interesting. I'm now, you know, looking at examples of class societies for this, and thinking about the whole issue of a balance or exchange of products in terms of use values, which is a bit of a strange idea. One of the things that you notice about class societies is that these myths almost always suggest that, you know, yeah, the ruling class is getting tribute in food or whatever, they're extracting a surplus product from all this work people are doing for them, but, you know, they give back so much, you know, like. And anyway, we'll come to some examples of that. So there's a sense, what you could say about these ideologies is that they have the same basic formula, which is that the ruling class provides various goods and services which are absolutely crucial for society in one way or another. So, you know, you shouldn't think of them as exploiters, you know, they're so benevolent. Anyway. So, okay, so now I'm going to, most of the rest of the talk is going to be taken up with looking at particular examples, because I think it's really interesting to see how these class societies work out. And because of, when at the end of this, you'll see that they actually have they're very similar in many ways, despite the mad differences between them. And the fact that they have virtually nothing to do with each other, they're not causally connected, one doesn't imitate the other and so on. Okay, so in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's family, and the pharaohs themselves, like as kind of kings of the society, are supposedly incarnations of the falcon god Horus. Interesting and not atypical that a falcon is chosen in this role. Why? Because it lives up in the sky, you know, and oversees everything, right? And it's a bird of prey. yeah, that's right. So the intervention of the pharaohs, supposed, you know, the ceremonies they conduct and with their priests, and often they're the head of the religion as well, supposedly secures the regular flooding of the Nile and protects crops from diseases and from wild animals. And one of the things the pharaohs used to do is go around hunting hippopotamuses, which seems like an appalling thing to do. But you can remember that in irrigation of the Nile and so on, the swamps and so on, hippopotamuses could come out of the swamp and destroy someone's crops and so on. So in a sense, you know, there they are doing this very useful work. Their rule is supposed to contain chaos. So, you know, as they defeat armies from other states and so on, they're portrayed as, you know, like saving the kingdom from chaos, and they're saving from your kingdom from the chaos that would occur if the subordinate class were to rise up in rebellion and undermine their control. Not only are they incarnations of the falcon god Horus, but also they're the sons, you know, like literally the sons. You might not believe this, but what they were, the sons of the sun god Re. And you know, these pyramids, well, the idea is that after death, the pharaoh walks up to the top of this pyramid, or his spirit ascends through the top of the pyramid and goes up to join the sun god in the sky. There you go. And the metaphor that was used in this context was the herder looking after cattle, or the shepherd looking after sheep, and that's why they were shown with a crook, you know, like a long hook for grabbing the legs of the cattle and so on. Their other role, you know, like their other benevolence, if you like, was to keep rival states at bay. Well, of course, these rival states were certainly in danger to the subordinate class. They'd come in with their armies and kill people and take the crops and so on and so forth. So, you know, but in a sense, it's a protection racket, because, you know, one state protects the citizens of its state from the depredations of the other state, and vice versa, you know. The pharaohs, as the pharaoh family, you know, like the clan, which is the pharaoh clan, if you like, they appoint representatives at the local village level who become an aristocratic elite. The subordinate class produces a surplus of wheat and barley. That's the main cereal crop, through irrigation agriculture, and that's important, and I'll come back to that in the next talk. They are taxed, for example, to provide grain or labor services, you know. So in the form of tax is like a tribute in grain, like wheat or barley, yeah, okay, or labor services like working on the pyramids, you know, doing something like that. This surplus of food that they produce in the form of grain and so on is used to feed the aristocracy, obviously, the priesthood, second group, the bureaucrats who organize all the tax systems and control everything, and you know, the flooding of the Nile and the irrigation and so on, and the soldiers, like, you know, who are in the armies, and the workers who are producing the pyramids, and the workers who are producing the weapons and all of the luxury goods and everything. The construction of these monuments, these pyramids and similar temples and so on, before the pyramids and after them, backs up the claim to be divine and is a demonstration of power and control. You know, like, this is a huge undertaking, and at the end of it, you've produced something which looks like it must have come from heaven. It's so amazing and so on. Now, typical of the sort of exchange of use values that I'm talking about with class societies, while the pharaohs and the pharaoh aristocratic elite live well, the common people suffer from periodic famines when the Nile doesn't flood properly and so on and so forth, and they die in droves. But also, as workers, they suffer from terrible, you know, they're flogged to death. I mean, basically, the life expectancy of someone working on the pyramids was between 18 and 40 years, and all of the people doing that suffered from appalling back problems, arthritis problems, and so on, and etc. Whereas the wealthier classes were living between 50 and 75 years. All right, now I'm going to turn to a completely different society, Sparta. This is Sparta, you know, like 600 BC to 500 BC, that sort of period, to 400 BC, whatever. One of the most famous, of course, of the ancient Greek city-states. Okay, so we'll probably go through this fairly quickly. The ruling class here are citizens and landowners, okay? So they own the estates on which people who are the subordinate class, produce a surplus product. That they're the owners of these as, like in a sense as private property. They're a landowning aristocracy. They're also referred to as citizens, meaning in the sense that they have a political vote, the power to vote. But also, as well as that, although the top aristocrats don't serve in the army, the ordinary citizens, the ordinary aristocrats, like the middle of the road aristocrats, they all do army service for the state. So in this context, then the ruling class and the armed forces are like that. They're part of the elite is joined, So whereas I say there's a 3-class model, in this case, those 2 classes are actually joined. The subordinate class are slaves or helots. So the Spartans originally conquered a neighboring territory called Messenia, but also they also had slaves before that. And the number of the slaves compared to the citizens was up to 7 times as many slaves as citizens. So that gives you an idea of how much the surplus product these people were controlling. They were controlling the surplus product from like one aristocrat for seven other people working for them. The helots, these slaves would produce the food on which the ruling class depends. Well, that's pretty obvious. So it was including olives and wheat and so on. And they used to give half of their crop to the citizens, to the state, or to local landowners who owned the land on which they were working as slaves. Now, also in terms of use values and also in terms of means of controlling this subordinate class, the Spartans were always very worried about revolts of the helots, and there were in fact revolts which were put down. So they were subject to ritual humiliation in sort of stage plays and things like that, treated as idiots, basically daily mistreatment, like beatings and stuff like that. And then as well as that, young men who were citizens who were learning and how to be fighters and so on would be the Spartans would actually declare war on the slave class, giving the young men the right to go and kill people, kill the helots. And in one of these killing fests, 4,000 helots were killed. I mean, the population as a whole was like 40,000 or something. So this is quite a lot of people. The ideology, the set of beliefs which backed up this Spartan class system treated the ruling class as superior by virtue of their courage and martial prowess. As well as being civilized, compared to the slaves who were considered as uncivilized barbarians. Well, what I'd say about that is, in fact, the superior weapons and armament which the Spartan citizens used to control the slaves were actually produced by slaves. It was slaves, like I said, working to produce the bronze which they used for their chest plates and their pads on their knees and stuff like that, stop them getting, and their helmets and all that, and the iron swords that they used, and with irons and an iron a spear with an iron point and so on. All of these weapons were being produced by the slaves. They were doing the hard work in mining, which was actually killing work as it was set up. And the food, of course, that they were living on was also created by this slave class. So, and of course, the citizens were released from the necessity to do farm work so they could spend time training themselves as soldiers. So we can see how the whole class system depends upon and works through various aspects of human nature, the desire to be fed and so on, and the fear of death and all of that sort of stuff. Well, now I'm going to look at the Incas. Now, I mean, it's very interesting, like class societies seem to have been set up in different parts of the world, roughly in the same period. That were quite separate from each other and probably don't owe that much, if anything at all. And the Incas is a case in point because, what do the Incas owe to the Egyptians and so on? Probably not a lot, but it's a remarkably similar organization of society. The subordinate class in the Inca society farmed maize, quinoa or whatever, and potatoes. They also had domesticated animals such as llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs, which they used to eat. The empire of the Incas was about 10 million people. It succeeded various smaller empires in that area before it. the ruling aristocracy was only 40,000 people, right? The ruling Inca aristocracy, the Inca clan, if you like, the top of the top, was only 40,000, as against a subordinate class of, you know, close to 10 million people, or at least 6 million to 10, depending on the estimate. They extracted the surplus product in the form of taxes, in kind, and in labor service. So not that different to the Egyptians. They would take, you know, food and alpacas and you know, grains and so on, as well as labor service, you know, like building the roads, producing the weapons, you know, like mining, obviously. They used to the kind of metal they used was copper, I'm pretty sure, and nothing else. And this labor service was called mita. And they had they didn't have any writing, they didn't have any money, they had no markets and so on. So it's very interesting. It's like a class society pared down to its bare essentials. A tribute produced by the subordinate class goes to the ruling class. Now, this is another essential, was quantification and record keeping. So the part of the role of the sort of professional elite, there was a professional elite of accountants, and they used knotted cords and strings with knots in them to record how much, you know, seasons, the days of the year, how much grains a particular family had produced on their plot, how big was their plot, all of these kind of details and so on. So this kind of accounting is actually a necessity of any class society, and quantification and counting go with all class societies. Now let's look at the ideology. The ruling class, the ruling family, are descended from the sun god, a remarkable parallel with Egypt. They own the whole of the land. In theory, they own everything, you know, right? And they make allocations of land to leading aristocrats who then have a landed estate and can live off the labor services from that landed estate and the services of food and so on. And these leading aristocrats have bureaucratic control of regions and also ownership, as I said, of agricultural estates. Human sacrifice is a part of the rituals of the Inca and previous empires in that region, and not to mention other Middle American regions. And these rituals are designed to maintain the seasons and celebrate victories, and also in elite burials. Now, one of the interesting things about that, again, is that, you know, like the ruling class is giving back to society the very control of the seasons. You know, like, unless we don't do this ritual, you know, there'll be a terrible drought and you'll all die, right? Okay, so that's really important work, and they've got to do it, right? And in terms of burials, you know, like de rigueur, like totally common for male members of the aristocratic elite to be buried with 2 young women. And as well as that, like up to 4,000 were killed in and interred in one Inca burial of an elite member or of the Inca, you know, like the king, whatever. The elite were represented pictorially as pumas, you know, a savage, vicious cat from the point of view of humans living in jungles, and a birds of prey, you know, including vultures, right? So yeah, there you go. The army, okay, you know, as I said, there's 3 parts. The army is ruled by the Inca elite, but also includes common soldiers. So here there's a bit of amalgamation between the army and the peasant subordinate class. These peasant subordinate classes sort of serve as kind of, you know, the ordinary soldiers who aren't particularly well armed or protected and so on, but there's lots of them, and they choose like 1 in 50 or something from a village to go and do this labor service in the army. And so again, looking at the total population, as I said, between 6 and 10 million. The army was about 200,000 people, and then there was a special royal guard, which is really almost part of the aristocracy, which was 10,000 people, men. The ruling class uses the agricultural tribute to feed the elite, right? And to maintain their armies, craft workers and builders. monumental architecture, huge temples and these step pyramidal temples and so on, were a symbol of elite rule, and also huge elaborate costumes in these rituals, you know, regalia, if you like, and lavish burials, and like I said, you know, buried with lots of weapons and luxury goods and slaves and so on. Very interesting that the expansion of the Incan Empire was made necessary by an arrangement in which, at the death of an Inca, right, the king, of the siblings, only one would become the next Inca. They had to expand the Inca territory to get more taxes to fund their own operations, and the rest of the existing set of taxes from the existing lands of the Incas went to their siblings, you know, like the brothers and sisters who did not become the Inca. So this, you know, like, expansion becomes necessary, but of course it's also makes sense because you want to control any rival state and make sure you've conquered it, because otherwise it might grow up and become big, just like the Incas themselves did in relationship to rival states at that time. There was a system of roads to enable armies and goods exchange. Just like in ancient Egypt, the basic agricultural strategy was irrigated agriculture. And for example, they've done tests to show that on a non-irrigated field, you could grow, you know, 10 tons of potatoes. On an irrigated field, you could grow 40 tons. So 4 times the productivity through that. And these irrigated lands are surrounded by desert. So what I'll come to this in the next talk, but what that means is there's nowhere for the subordinate class to go. Once a population gets to a certain size, it's dependent upon irrigated agriculture and they can't live without it. The irrigation infrastructure is maintained by labour service organised by the aristocracy in each district. Just like I was saying for Egypt, there's lots of evidence of the poor health of the subordinate peasant classes compared to the rich and compared to previous tribal societies that lived in those regions. I mean, basically, you know, a diet made up mostly of staples with not a lot of meat and stuff, and probably not a lot of vegetables is not a brilliant diet. And then you're being worked to death. It's not a good combination. And not to mention, you know, being clustered together in towns means that diseases are readily communicated from one person to the next. Okay, feudal Europe. Okay, so this is a society we all know really well from Monty Python films. I mean, you know. The king is supposedly appointed by God, all right? So the divine right of kings, which ended up with King Charles I getting his head chopped off. The king owns the whole nation, you know, like in theory, the king owns the whole of the land. And what they do is that they appoint, you know, like the aristocracy to rule over manors on their behalf. So there's no kind of private ownership like there is in capitalist society. You know, it's like, it's not, you don't own your own manor. You've been granted the right to use that manor on behalf of the king because you're a loyal subject of the king. This is the lord of the manor. And then what do you do in return? You provide knights in armor, soldiers, and so on from your manor to fight the king's wars. Right, and then the same structure applies between the knights and the lords of the manor and the ordinary peasant class. Okay, so same idea. The peasants don't own the plots of land on which they actually live and work and inherit and so on from their parents. No, that's really owned by the lord of the manor. And what the peasant does is say, produce a tribute in grains, or it could be some other kind of labor service, even like making the lord's bed, feeding the lord's hounds, whatever, you know, it could be anything. But also, obviously, these things are done by the peasant class, are producing a surplus product which is appropriated by the ruling aristocratic elite. The myth. Okay, now let's talk about the myths that animate all of this. You know, what does the aristocracy and the king give back to society? Well, peasants are rewarded in heaven for their obedience. Like they'd go to hell if they didn't do what the king and the aristocracy said. You know, obedience is part of God's will. You don't forget that. And so this is like a return of an unreal product. It's a pretty massively amazing product, but it's totally unreal. But, you know, you will live forever and ever in God's grace. And we're surrounded by angels. I mean, God, that's pretty good. Another thing is the great chain of being. You know, in other words, God set up this system in a particular way. Okay, the great chain of being, it starts off with God, then there's the angels next, and then there's the king, and then there's the aristocrats, and then there's the peasants, and then there's the cows and sheep, and then there's every blade of grass. So this is like a sort of cosmology of nested authority and hierarchy going down right from the top right down to the bottom. You're also rewarded by protection, you know, the same as we've seen before, from other lords and kings and their armies. And again, that's no joking matter. I mean, thousands of peasants were killed in various stupid wars in Europe in this period. But of course, again, it's a protection racket, you know, like without any lords at all, there wouldn't be this problem. But with lords and kings and the fact that they can extract surplus product and get people to dig up iron and make it into armor and so on and feed their horses and all of that. Yeah, well, yeah, you better be scared. All right, so now I'm going to look at capitalism and point out that capitalist society, despite considerable differences in how it appears and how it's kind of theorized ideologically, is actually another form of class society and works the same way. Okay, so the ruling class are the owners of the capital, the means of production, you know, like what we talk about, the 1% and so on. The money generally is a king in capitalist society. In other class societies, money has a very minor and subordinate role compared to in capitalism. What does money do in any context, not just in capitalist societies? It delivers the capacity to access the products of the work of other people, which always means that the work of those other people is alienated in Marx's sense. In other words, they don't control the means of production on which they work. They don't own the places where they're doing their work and the things that they do. They have to put their goods and services on the market, or their boss takes it from them if they're slaves and puts those things on the market or whatever. So this money gives this claim to the goods and services available on the market produced by alienated workers, right? And this claim is a kind of autonomy to satisfy a whole range of needs, you know, like have housework done, get your car washed, you know, buy a new suit, anything basically, or, you know, buy a vast factory. I mean, it's pretty unlimited. So depending on, so it depends, but it does, anyway, we'll come back to that. All right, now let's have, this is Marx's great discovery in a way. Capitalism seems to be founded on equality, because, like, okay, you're the worker and you're free to work for anyone. You're not like feudal society where you're tied to the lord of the manor. You're free to work for anyone you like, right? And what you do is you approach that person and you say, okay, you know, or he says, whatever, I'll pay you $100, and you go, yeah, that's a good price for my labor. I can't get more than that elsewhere, and da da da. So it's just like, you know, you say, how many oranges have you got here, and how many apples is that worth, and you exchange, and there's an equal exchange, and the monetary value of both is the same, and you know, what's not to like? This is equality. And so the capitalist is buying your labor at a fair price, and Marx got this idea that actually there's a form of surplus extraction in this. So, okay, this is I'm now going to explain it. A working day produces monetary value, which is a capacity to access the work of other people via the market. The worker only gets a proportion of that capacity. They don't get the full capacity of monetary value that their work is producing. the owner or boss of the firm, you know, even if it's a public service department or whatever, gets the rest, the surplus of monetary value, meaning a capacity to access the work of other people. So in other words, what we're saying is that the worker produces more monetary value than they're paid in their wage, right? And that's the surplus product. That's just the same as the tribute in grain, in wheat, or, you know, making the Lord's bed and feeding his hounds, or whatever. It's no different, really. It's just in a monetary form. And Marx talks about it in terms of hours of work. So 6 hours of work, you're producing the monetary value which you get in your wage, and the other 2 hours of work, you're producing value for the capitalist, right? This basic relationship enables the ruling class to accumulate capital and to increase their market power over time. So because they're constantly getting this feed-in of surplus value all the time from the people that they're employing as workers, they can use that money to increase their holdings, you know, their means of production, their, you know, whether it's, you know, like I said, a bank, factory, railway service, or whatever it might be. There's also what Marx refers to as primitive accumulation. So this is another way in which the capitalist class gains control of the means of production. Primitive accumulation is when the state or the capitalist class manages to secure means of production without actually having to pay for them as on the market, right? So the most important classic example of that is the enclosures. I think I talked about that in the lecture on Marx's theory of class. In Europe, where the common lands which were owned together by peasants were then taken off them and given to the aristocracy. That's primitive accumulation. But it's also situations like settler societies, like, you know, white farmers who still own, you know, a vast majority of the land in South Africa. They got that land because the white armies conquered black people using, you know, of course, advanced weapons and so on. No wonder. And that's primitive accumulation. Also, say the end of the Soviet Union, when all these oligarchs took over means of production, you know, kind of wealth that was previously owned by the state. All right. Now let's look at the army, role of the army and police force. They're paid from the surplus value produced by workers. So the money that's used, however it's gathered in taxes, or if it's a private army or whatever, it comes from the surplus value of products and material goods that are able to be bought because the workers are producing more monetary value than they're being paid monetary value. And the role of these people is to enforce the ownership of means of production, and also to take control of areas of the world and run them in the interest of the capitalist class. The mythology of current capitalism is that the capitalists produce various gifts to the population at large. Okay, so I've talked about one of these myths already, the fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And you know, and I've said there's actually a surplus of monetary value produced and appropriated. So this is not actually a myth of a gift, but it's a myth of equality, you know, and there's a balance here. Capitalist gives you money and you do the work, you know, there's the equality, right? Actually, no. Representative democracy, you know, in other words, you're not under control like those terrible, you know, the situation of the serfs or slaves of previous class societies. No, you've got the freedom to choose the political options in elections. But this choice is something of a myth. Why? Because political options are constrained by the market. You as an employee need a job in order to live. You've got to have a job, right? So if someone comes up with a wonderful plan to improve society and you think this is going to lead to unemployment, or it's going to lead to me being unemployed, or maybe, you know, maybe other members of the working class with who I feel some allegiance in, basically it's not good politics from my point of view for this initiative to be pursued, because it'll lead to unemployment. So you're going to vote against it. I mean, this is classically what happened in the last Australian federal elections, when the Adani mine was the issue and the CFMEU jumped up and down and said, oh, we need the Adani mine for jobs, you know, and like, it's not so much that other workers thought, oh, gee, I'm hoping for a job in the Adani mine, but what they thought was, we don't want the middle class cutting off options for jobs, you know, the middle class of moralists, do-gooder, greenies and so on, cutting off options for employment to the working class. We regard that as insulting and da-da-da. And so, in other words, they're forced by the logic of the economic system to behave politically in a particular way. So the democratic, you know, equal democratic control of political life and making decisions for the whole of society is somewhat mythological. But what it seems to do is it seems to represent a gift, an egalitarian gift by the capitalist class to the whole of society. Yeah, it's not a, you know, we're not pulling strings, we're not doing anything, you know, da da da. Who, me? You know. Another way that the capitalist class seems to provide for the society is they provide employment and consumer goods through their investments. In fact, what happens is they're using their money, their fictitious claim on society through their money, to access the dead and living labor of other people. I mean, their money's not making these things happen. It's the work that's being done by ordinary members of the community that is producing these goods and services. And don't forget that. Now, another idea is that the market is economic democracy. You know, like, well, if it's not on sale in the market and da-da-da, and the price is such and such and so on, well, that's just the way the market works. And it means it expresses the desires of everybody who goes out and buys what they want. You know, this is really illusory, partly because the freedom to buy market products varies with your wealth. So if you're living in a village in South Africa, and your wealth is like, you know, $10 every 3 months or something, excuse me, economic democracy? I don't think so. Okay, the other thing is that things that don't make a profit and are not on the market. And sometimes these are things which are really useful to people, but because they won't make a profit for any individual capitalist, there's no point in marketing them. Who wants to market them? And if there's a proposal to use taxes for government to provide these services, the capitalist class says, oh no, that'll cost jobs and they convince the voters that that's going to cost jobs, and nobody wants to have taxes. It seems like it's coming out of my money, you know, like it's going to pay government fat cats and so on. So what does that mean? It means that there are various desires that people have that are not expressed in the choices available to you on the market. And clearly, one of the main ones at the moment is a lot of people would like the climate to continue much as it has for the last 10,000 years and not to be completely destroyed by climate change. You can't buy that on the market because nobody's making a profit from that. Okay. In the recent COVID crisis, suddenly we found there were not enough labs making vaccines. To make vaccines, there was not enough supplies of personal protective garb for health workers. All of these things, because they weren't profitable. There weren't even enough hospitals or oxygen in India. I mean, all of this stuff, it's just, no one was making a profit out of this, and suddenly these things were not available on the market, despite the fact that people really want them. Okay, so now I'm going to finish off with a few ruminations about this situation. It's remarkable how similar these class structures are from different periods of history, from different places around the world, that have, in some cases, clearly had no relationship to each other, like Egypt, ancient Egypt and Iraq, or Sparta and ancient Egypt, or whatever, or, you know, minimal relationship to each other. Feudal Europe and Peru. I mean, yeah, right. It's like, so what does that tell us? So it tells us that social class is an invention of the human species. You know, it's like a kind of mechanism of social life, if you like, which fits with human nature. And I've explained why it does that. You know, it does that because it works on people's fear of death and their desire to eat and you know, et cetera, and the technological affordances created by cereal agriculture. Yeah, okay, and irrigation, not to mention irrigation. It's very hard to get rid of once it's established. We know this. There have been lots of revolutions and revolts and attempts to destroy class societies, and basically the history of these is that they've been unsuccessful in the long term. And what we have instead, if we look through from 10,000 years ago to now, from when class society was invented to the present day, we've got gradually increasing and encroaching class society, where class society takes over classless indigenous societies and destroys them, or at least, takes their land and so on. And so this means that it's a mechanism that's massively difficult to undo. And the other thing that's interesting, I mean, like I said, I've said this before, but it's like it's been invented in a number of different places. There have been 5 or 6 independent inventions. And what, paradoxically, these are all in the same time period, like the Mayans, 5,000 BC or, to 1000 AD or something like that, like European class societies in the same period, China, Japan, the Indus River Valley, India. It's spooky, there's no two ways about it. There's a material structural basis, the ownership of the means of production, or at least the control by armed force of the means of production, producing the basic necessities of life. 1. 2, cereal agriculture. 3, using cereal agriculture to provide a surplus from the work of people appropriated by the ruling class. Another part of the material structure is urban centres, that the sort of location, organisational location of the ruling class, and they control out from that in a network to siphon off resources from the rural areas. There's a common ideological basis for class societies, which is very bizarre. I mean, I take it that it's part of human nature to expect that when you provide something to a group of people, that they will provide something roughly equivalent. I mean, there's no way to measure equivalence and use value, but at least some use value that makes sense in return. So what we get in class societies, ideologies, or, like mythological constructions in which the ruling class provides the subordinate class with some sort of unreal and ultimately magical, that they say they're doing things they can't possibly do, like preventing a drought or something, or they're giving someone an unreal gift, like eternity in heaven or whatever. And these gifts balance the exploitation that's being carried on at the same time. And even as I said, even in capitalist society, you get these kind of mythologies. We can look at some of the less material aspects of class society. Writing, like, okay, the Incas didn't have writing, but all of the other societies that I've mentioned, most class societies have writing and quantification. These two things are necessary for the ruling class to run the mechanism of a class society, to extract the surplus product in predictable ways that are not going to lead to people starving to death or something like that, and then they lose their subordinate class. And they've got to, adjust this to the climate in any particular time, and so on. And they've got to pay their armies. There's a huge administrative apparatus associated with class that's not present in classless societies, stateless societies, and that leads to writing. Monumentalism, huge monumental buildings, often made of stone, but also mud and so on, which demonstrate the power, the amazing power of the ruling class. The regalia, so ceremonies in classless societies also involve regalia, like, Indigenous Australians dressing up in bands of feathers and white feathers and stuff like that. I mean, regalia is not a new thing for the human species, but in class societies, the regalia is given and concentrated in the ruling class, and the peasant class doesn't wear it. So the regalia demonstrates the sort of superiority of the ruling class. The status of the ruling class are regarded as important and you know, and in a sense, social approval goes with being a member of the ruling class. The spectacles that they engineer, you know, like in every case, it's just amazing. The spectacles like ancient Egypt, you know, the Incas. I'm not so sure about Sparta, maybe, but you know, like feudal Europe, no two ways about it. You know, the huge cathedrals and everything. The ruling class organises spectacles which demonstrate their rule, and these are massive exercises in human creativity and artistic flair and so on. But they also represent the power of the ruling class. Money, okay, money. I'll talk about money in other talks, but money, as I said, not in the Incas, but money is also a common thing in class societies, and I'll discuss why that is later on. So all I'd say about that, you know, at the end of all of this, I feel like it's a sense of the uncanny. You know, it's like a death cult. I mean, the Cahokia. There was an example in the Cahokia which I just find totally chilling. I was watching a video, and there was a grave spread out of a member of the elite of that class society, and there's this skeleton of this guy, and it's surrounded by shells which have been brought from long distances away with shiny shells, right? And they're arranged in the shape of a falcon, right? The bird of prey. Ooh. And there's 18 skeletons of people, women mostly, sacrificed at this guy's death. This is a death cult. These people believe that they're going to live forever, and kind of everybody kind of goes along with that, at least in practice, even if they may not entirely believe it. It's spooky, you know. There's no two ways about it. Like fictions become real in class society. The myth of the vampire, you know, like the vampire stalks abroad. So I'll leave it with that. And next time I'm going to talk about, you know, how did class society come about? How did ordinary people who were living in egalitarian communal societies in which they expressed their sociability and creativity in really interesting and fun ways, how are these societies destroyed by class society? How did that happen? Okay, bye now.